The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's main entrance as Colonel Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her civilian sedan. At 34, she looked younger than most lieutenants, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches in her combat boots. Her auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform bore the silver eagles that few people bothered to notice at first glance. Sarah had earned her rank through 15 years of dedicated service, multiple deployments, and a mind that could solve logistical nightmares that left seasoned generals scratching their heads. She held advanced degrees in military strategy and international relations, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had personally overseen operations that saved countless lives. Yet today, like most days, she would face the same challenge that had followed her throughout her career. The guard at the main gate was new. Private Johnson, according to his name tag, couldn't have been more than 19 years old. His eyes swept over Sarah's approach with the casual disinterest of someone who had been on duty too long. "Morning, miss," he said, not bothering to straighten his posture. "Visiting someone on base today?" Sarah reached for her military identification, her expression remaining neutral despite the familiar sting of assumption. "Colonel Mitchell reporting for the Joint Operations Briefing." Private Johnson's eyebrows shot up as he took her ID, his casual demeanor evaporating instantly. He studied the card carefully, then looked at Sarah, then back at the card. His face flushed red as he snapped to attention. "My apologies, Colonel. I didn't. I mean, welcome to Fort Bragg, ma'am." "At ease, Private," Sarah replied calmly. "It happens more often than you might think." This interaction was nothing new for Sarah. Throughout her career, she had collected stories that would have discouraged a lesser person. During her deployment to Afghanistan, a visiting congressman had asked her to fetch him coffee, assuming she was someone's assistant. At a NATO summit in Brussels, security personnel had repeatedly questioned her presence in classified briefings. Even within her own command structure, new personnel routinely mistook her for a clerk or administrative assistant. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same attributes that made people underestimate her, her youthful appearance and petite stature, had often been her greatest operational advantages. Enemy combatants didn't expect tactical brilliance from someone who looked like she belonged in a college classroom rather than a war zone. Sarah drove through the base toward the Joint Operations Center, her mind already focused on the day's agenda. The briefing she was attending involved coordination between multiple military branches for an upcoming humanitarian mission in Southeast Asia. As the Army's lead logistics coordinator for the operation, she would be presenting supply chain strategies that could mean the difference between success and failure for thousands of people in need. The parking area outside the operations center buzzed with activity. Officers from various branches hurried toward the building, their uniforms displaying ranks from lieutenant to general. Sarah parked her sedan between 2 massive SUVs and gathered her briefing materials. As she approached the building's entrance, she noticed a cluster of junior officers standing near the doors. They were engaged in animated conversation about the upcoming briefing, speculating about which senior officers would be present and what the mission parameters might involve. "I heard Colonel Mitchell is supposed to present the logistics overview," one young captain was saying. "Word is this guy is supposed to be some kind of tactical genius." "Yeah, I've heard stories about Mitchell," replied a Navy lieutenant. "Apparently handled supply lines for 3 different operations simultaneously while under enemy fire. That takes serious skill." Sarah paused momentarily, amused by the conversation. She had learned long ago that her reputation often preceded her, but rarely in the way people expected. The stories about her capabilities were accurate, but the assumptions about her appearance never were. "Excuse me," she said politely, stepping around the group. One of the officers, a Marine lieutenant, glanced at her dismissively. "Administrative entrance is around the side, miss. This entrance is for briefing participants only." Sarah's expression remained unchanged. "Thank you for the information, Lieutenant. I believe I'm in the right place." She continued toward the entrance, her credentials already in hand. Behind her, she could hear confused murmurs from the group as they tried to process what had just happened. Inside the operations center, the main briefing room was arranged with tiered seating facing a large presentation screen. Officers filed in according to protocol, with senior ranks claiming seats in the front rows. Sarah made her way to the designated presenters area, setting up her materials on the table reserved for briefing officers. Major General Harrison, the mission commander, entered the room with his aide. Sarah had worked with Harrison before on 2 previous operations, and he had learned to value her expertise despite initial skepticism years earlier. "Colonel Mitchell," Harrison said, approaching her position. "Good to see you again. Ready to walk us through the supply chain magic?" "Always ready, sir," Sarah replied with a slight smile. Harrison's aide, a young captain Sarah didn't recognize, looked confused by the exchange. He leaned closer to the general and whispered something that made Harrison chuckle. "Captain Rodriguez," Harrison said loud enough for nearby officers to hear, "meet Colonel Sarah Mitchell. She's the officer responsible for keeping our people supplied and alive during this mission. I suggest you pay very close attention to her briefing." Captain Rodriguez's face reddened as he realized his mistake. "My apologies, Colonel. I didn't realize." "No harm done, Captain," Sarah said diplomatically. "Focus on the mission. That's what matters." As the room filled with personnel, Sarah noticed the familiar pattern of glances and whispered conversations that her presence always seemed to generate. Some officers who knew her reputation nodded respectfully. Others appeared puzzled by the young woman sitting among the senior presenters. The briefing was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. Sarah reviewed her notes one final time, ensuring every detail of her presentation was perfect. She had learned that being underestimated meant she had to perform at twice the level of her peers to receive the same recognition. This standard had pushed her to become exceptional at her job, but the constant need to prove herself was exhausting. Her presentation would cover supply line establishment, risk assessment for humanitarian aid distribution, and coordination protocols between military and civilian organizations. The operation would affect nearly 50,000 displaced persons, and every detail of the logistics plan could impact lives. A Navy commander entering the room caught sight of Sarah and approached with obvious confusion. "Excuse me, miss," he said quietly. "I think there might be some mistake. This briefing is restricted to field-grade officers and above." Sarah looked up from her materials, her patience wearing thin but her professionalism intact. "Commander, I appreciate your concern for security protocols. However, I'm exactly where I need to be." The commander's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with her response. "I'm going to need to see some identification. Security is tight for this operation." Before Sarah could respond, Major General Harrison's voice boomed across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. We have a complex mission ahead of us, and I want everyone focused on the briefing materials." Harrison gestured toward Sarah. "Our first presenter is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, who will be outlining the logistical framework for this operation." Colonel Mitchell has successfully coordinated supply operations in 7 different theaters, including 3 active combat zones. Her strategies have consistently exceeded performance benchmarks while maintaining cost efficiency. The Navy commander who had questioned Sarah's presence appeared to shrink into his seat. Around the room, officers adjusted their attention toward the woman they had dismissed moments earlier. Sarah stood and moved to the presentation podium with practiced confidence. She had delivered hundreds of briefings throughout her career, but each one carried the weight of having to prove herself all over again. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the room. "Today we'll examine the logistical challenges of delivering humanitarian aid to a region with limited infrastructure, active security threats, and a population of displaced persons with varying immediate needs." The large screen behind her displayed a detailed map of the operation area, marked with proposed supply routes, distribution points, and contingency locations. Every aspect of the plan reflected months of careful analysis and coordination with multiple agencies. "Our primary objective is establishing sustainable supply lines that can deliver food, medical supplies, and temporary shelter materials to 53,000 displaced persons currently located in 12 different refugee settlements." As Sarah continued her presentation, the room's attention became completely focused on her expertise. Officers took detailed notes as she explained risk mitigation strategies, supply chain redundancies, and coordination protocols that would ensure mission success. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. The same officers who had questioned her presence were now hanging on every word of her tactical analysis. But Sarah knew that this pattern would repeat itself again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until her retirement. The challenge of being underestimated had become as routine as morning inspection. 3 weeks after the Fort Bragg briefing, Sarah found herself standing in the humid morning air of Kandahar airfield in Afghanistan. The humanitarian mission had evolved into something far more complex than originally planned. Intelligence reports indicated that local insurgent groups were planning to intercept supply convoys, turning what should have been a straightforward aid operation into a high-stakes military challenge. Sarah had volunteered to deploy forward to oversee the logistics personally. Her superiors had initially resisted the idea, suggesting that a colonel's expertise would be better utilized from a command center thousands of miles away. But Sarah understood something that desk-bound planners often missed: successful logistics required adapting to ground truth, and ground truth could only be assessed in person. The forward operating base buzzed with activity as multiple military units prepared for the expanded mission. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine personnel worked alongside international coalition forces, creating a complex web of command structures and communication protocols that could easily become tangled without careful coordination. Sarah's temporary office was located in a converted shipping container that had been divided into workspace and sleeping quarters. The accommodations were Spartan, but they provided everything she needed to maintain operational oversight 24 hours a day. On her second morning at the FOB, Sarah was reviewing convoy schedules when Sergeant First Class Williams knocked on her office door. "Ma'am, there's a situation developing with the civilian contractors," Williams reported. "The local transport company is refusing to honor their agreement. They're demanding additional security guarantees and a 50% increase in payment." Sarah looked up from her computer screen. Sergeant Williams had been assigned as her liaison with ground personnel, and he had quickly proven to be both competent and reliable. Unlike many of the officers she encountered, Williams had focused on her credentials rather than her appearance from their first meeting. "What's their specific concern about security?" Sarah asked. "They claim they've received threats about collaborating with coalition forces. The company owner wants to meet with the senior logistics officer to renegotiate terms." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Local contractor relations were often the weakest link in overseas operations. The civilian transport companies provided crucial capabilities that military assets couldn't match, but they also operated under different risk calculations and motivations. "Schedule the meeting for 1400 hours, Sarah decided. Location should be the main conference room. I want adequate security present, but not so obvious that it feels like intimidation." Sergeant Williams paused at the door. "Ma'am, should I inform them they'll be meeting with you specifically? The company owner might have expectations about meeting with someone who looks more like their idea of a senior officer?" Sarah finished with a slight smile. "Let's let that be a surprise, Sergeant. It might work to our advantage." At exactly 1400 hours, Sarah entered the conference room where 3 Afghan contractors waited with a translator. The company owner, a middle-aged man named Mahmoud Kazemi, had brought 2 associates who appeared to be handling security and financial negotiations. Kazemi's expression shifted from confusion to mild annoyance as Sarah took her seat at the head of the conference table. "Where is the logistics commander?" Kazemi asked through the translator. "We were told we would meet with the senior officer responsible for convoy operations." "You are," Sarah replied calmly in Dari, one of the 4 languages she spoke fluently. The surprise on Kazemi's face was immediate and unmistakable. The translator started to interpret Sarah's words, but Kazemi held up his hand to stop him. He studied Sarah more carefully, taking note of her colonel's eagles and the confident way she had taken control of the meeting. "You speak our language," Kazemi observed, switching to Dari himself. "I speak your language, I understand your business concerns, and I have the authority to approve modifications to our contract," Sarah replied. What specific security guarantees do you need to resume transport operations? For the next 45 minutes, Sarah negotiated directly with Kazemi in his native language, discussing route security, payment schedules, and risk mitigation strategies. She had spent months studying the regional dynamics that affected civilian contractors, and she understood that their concerns were often more complex than simple financial considerations. Kazemi's initial skepticism gradually transformed into professional respect as Sarah demonstrated detailed knowledge of local security conditions, tribal politics, and the economic pressures facing Afghan transport companies. She offered security modifications that would genuinely reduce risks for his drivers while staying within the mission's operational parameters. "You understand our situation better than most coalition officers," Kazemi admitted near the end of the meeting. "Many of your colleagues see only their own mission requirements. Successful logistics means understanding everyone's mission requirements," Sarah replied. "If your drivers feel secure, our supplies reach the people who need them. Everyone benefits." The renegotiated contract included enhanced convoy security protocols and modest payment adjustments that reflected the increased risk environment. More importantly, it established a communication framework that would allow rapid problem-solving if conditions changed again. After Kazemi and his associates left, Sergeant Williams approached Sarah with obvious admiration. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of contract negotiations go badly." "That was impressive." "Language skills help," Sarah said modestly. "But the key is remembering that everyone at the table has legitimate concerns that need to be addressed." Later that afternoon, Sarah was conducting a site inspection of the main supply depot when she encountered a group of marine logistics specialists who had arrived that morning. The Marines were establishing a parallel supply chain for their own operations, and coordination between the Army and Marine systems would be crucial for overall mission success. The Marine detachment was led by Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, an experienced officer with multiple combat deployments. Chen's reputation for efficiency and attention to detail had preceded him, and Sarah looked forward to working with someone who shared her commitment to operational excellence. However, Chen's initial reaction to meeting Sarah followed a predictable pattern. "I'm looking for Colonel Mitchell," Chen announced to Sergeant Williams as Sarah approached their position near the depot's main loading dock. "You found her, sir," Williams replied, gesturing toward Sarah. Chen's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and, finally, resignation as he processed the information. He extended his hand to Sarah with professional courtesy, but his body language suggested lingering skepticism. "Colonel Mitchell, I've heard impressive things about your logistics work. I'm looking forward to coordinating our operations." "Likewise, Colonel Chen. I understand you have some concerns about supply line redundancy for your marine operations?" As they walked through the depot, Sarah outlined her plans for integrating the Marine and Army logistics systems without creating conflicts or inefficiencies. She had anticipated the Marines' arrival and had already developed coordination protocols that would enhance rather than complicate both operations. Chen listened carefully to her explanations, asking detailed questions about capacity planning, risk management, and contingency procedures. His initial skepticism began to fade as Sarah demonstrated comprehensive understanding of both Army and Marine operational requirements. "This is more sophisticated than I expected," Chen admitted as they reviewed Sarah's integration plans. "Most joint logistics efforts end up creating more problems than they solve. That's usually because people focus on protecting their own systems instead of optimizing the overall mission," Sarah replied. "Our goal should be getting supplies to people who need them, not proving which branch has better procedures." Their collaboration proved to be immediately effective. Within 72 hours, the integrated logistics system was supporting both Army humanitarian operations and Marine security missions with improved efficiency and reduced resource conflicts. But Sarah's most significant challenge at the FOB wouldn't involve contractors or inter-service coordination. It would come from within her own command structure, testing not just her professional competence but her resilience as a leader. The challenge materialized in the form of Major Robert Sterling, a newly arrived officer who had been assigned to assist with convoy security coordination. Sterling had an impressive combat record and strong recommendations from his previous commanders, but he also carried assumptions about leadership that would clash directly with Sarah's authority. Their first meeting occurred during a morning briefing attended by all senior logistics personnel. Sarah was presenting updates on convoy schedules when Sterling interrupted with a question clearly intended to challenge her expertise. "Colonel, your proposed routing seems to ignore recent intelligence about IED placement patterns. Are you sure this approach provides adequate force protection?" Sarah paused her presentation and addressed Sterling's concern directly. "Major Sterling, the routing incorporates intelligence reports from the past 72 hours, including IED threat assessments from coalition intelligence sources. The routes have been validated by explosive ordnance disposal teams and approved by force protection officers." Sterling's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with her response. "With respect, ma'am, my experience in this theater suggests that theoretical route planning needs to be balanced against practical combat experience." The tension in the room was palpable as other officers recognized the challenge Sterling was presenting to Sarah's authority. This wasn't a professional disagreement about tactics, it was a direct questioning of her competence based on assumptions about her background. Sarah maintained her composure while addressing Sterling's challenge directly. "Major, your combat experience is valuable, and I want to ensure we're incorporating all available expertise. I'd like you to provide a detailed analysis of the routing concerns you've identified. We'll review your recommendations and modify our plans accordingly." This response demonstrated Sarah's confidence in her own planning while giving Sterling an opportunity to contribute constructively rather than simply criticize. It also put the responsibility on Sterling to support his challenges with specific evidence rather than general skepticism. The meeting concluded with tasks assigned and schedules confirmed, but Sarah knew that Sterling's attitude represented a broader challenge she would need to address decisively. The crisis began at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning when urgent radio traffic crackled through the Forward Operating Base Communication Center. Convoy Bravo 7, carrying medical supplies to a remote refugee settlement, had been ambushed 15 kilometers from their destination. Initial reports indicated casualties among both military personnel and civilian contractors. Sarah was awakened by Sergeant Williams pounding on her quarters door. She was dressed and, in the Tactical Operations Center within 3 minutes, her mind already shifting into crisis management mode. "What's our current situation, Sergeant?" she asked, moving quickly toward the communications station. "Convoy Bravo 7 is pinned down at checkpoint Delta 4, Williams reported, pointing to the location on the tactical map. They have 2 vehicles disabled and are requesting immediate medical evacuation for casualties. Enemy forces are estimated at 15 to 20 personnel with small arms and RPGs." Sarah studied the tactical display, rapidly calculating distances, response times, and available resources. The ambush location was in a narrow valley with limited approach routes, making rescue operations extremely dangerous. "Current weather conditions?" she asked. "Ceiling is too low for helicopter evacuation. Visibility is less than 2 miles with heavy cloud cover." Major Sterling burst into the operations center, still fastening his equipment harness. "What's the situation? Are we launching a rescue operation?" "We're assessing options," Sarah replied calmly, continuing to study the tactical information. Sterling moved to the radio console and began questioning the personnel on duty about response protocols. His aggressive approach to gathering information created unnecessary tension in an already stressful situation. "Who authorized the convoy to use that route?" Sterling demanded. "The route planning was obviously inadequate if they got ambushed." Sarah's jaw tightened at Sterling's implication, but she maintained her focus on the immediate crisis. "Major Sterling, I need you to coordinate with the medical team to prepare for incoming casualties. Leave the tactical response to me." Sterling's eyes flashed with anger. "With respect, Colonel, tactical rescue operations require combat experience. This isn't a logistics exercise." The operations center fell silent as every person present recognized the insubordination in Sterling's challenge. Sarah had reached a decision point that would define not just her authority at the FOB, but her credibility throughout her remaining military career. "Major Sterling," Sarah said in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, "you are relieved of duty. Report to your quarters immediately. Sergeant Williams will escort you." Sterling's face reddened with rage. "You can't relieve me. I'm the only officer here with actual combat leadership experience." "Sergeant Williams," Sarah continued without acknowledging Sterling's protest, "escort Major Sterling to his quarters. He is confined pending further review." As Williams moved to comply with Sarah's order, Sterling made a final desperate attempt to undermine her authority. "This is insane. Everyone in this room knows I'm right. She's going to get people killed because she's too proud to admit she's out of her depth." Sarah turned to face Sterling directly, her voice remaining steady and professional despite the gravity of the moment. "Major Sterling, you have 30 seconds to leave this operations center voluntarily, or you will be removed by security personnel. Your choice." Sterling glared at Sarah for a long moment before stalking out of the operations center with Williams following close behind. The remaining personnel waited for Sarah's next orders, their respect for her authority now clearly established. "All right, people," Sarah said, turning back to the tactical situation. "We have soldiers in contact who need our help. Lieutenant Morrison, what's our current QRF status?" Lieutenant Morrison, the Quick Reaction Force Coordinator, stepped forward with immediate information. 2 Bradley fighting vehicles ready for deployment, plus supporting infantry squad. Estimated travel time to contact area is 28 minutes. Sarah studied the terrain around the ambush site, calculating approach routes and tactical options. Her mind processed multiple variables simultaneously: enemy positions, casualty evacuation requirements, terrain advantages, and weather limitations. "The direct approach puts our QRF in the same vulnerable position as the convoy," she observed aloud. "Morrison, I want the QRF to approach from the northwest ridge. It's longer, but it gives us elevation advantage and multiple withdrawal routes." "Ma'am," Morrison replied, "that approach requires crossing 2 kilometers of open terrain." "Are you sure about the tactical risk?" Sarah pointed to the topographical display. "The open terrain becomes an advantage if we coordinate with close air support. Even with low ceiling conditions, we can get helicopter gun runs to suppress enemy positions while our QRF moves into flanking position." The tactical plan she outlined was complex and risky, but it addressed the fundamental weakness that had allowed the ambush to succeed. Instead of following predictable routes, the rescue operation would use terrain and coordinated air support to achieve tactical surprise. "Get me the air support coordinator on radio," Sarah ordered. "I want to discuss helicopter capabilities in current weather conditions." For the next 40 minutes, Sarah orchestrated a complex rescue operation that involved ground forces, helicopter support, and precisely timed coordination between multiple units. Her communications with the ambushed convoy provided real-time updates on enemy positions and casualty status. The rescue operation unfolded exactly as Sarah had planned. The Quick Reaction Force approached the ambush site from an unexpected direction while helicopter gun runs suppressed enemy positions. The coordination was so effective that the enemy forces withdrew before the QRF reached the contact area. Convoy Bravo 7 was extracted with all personnel accounted for. 3 soldiers required medical treatment for minor wounds, but no fatalities occurred. The medical supplies that had been the convoy's cargo were recovered intact and delivered to their destination the following day. As medical helicopters transported the wounded soldiers for treatment, Sarah received a radio call that would change everything about how her authority was perceived throughout the theater. "Kandahar Base, this is Pentagon Command," the radio operator announced. "We have priority traffic for Colonel Sarah Mitchell." Sarah took the radio handset with curiosity. Direct communication from Pentagon Command to field officers was extremely unusual and typically indicated either commendation or serious problems. "This is Colonel Mitchell," she responded. "Colonel Mitchell, this is General Patricia Hayes, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. I'm calling to inform you that your tactical handling of today's rescue operation has been noted at the highest levels of command." Sarah was surprised by the direct contact from such a senior Pentagon official. "Thank you, General. The operation was successful due to excellent coordination from all personnel involved. Colonel, I'm not calling about the rescue operation specifically. I'm calling because of how you handled the insubordination incident with Major Sterling. Your response demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership authority we need in complex operational environments. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and confusion. General, I'm not sure I understand the significance. Colonel Mitchell, Major Sterling contacted his previous commanders after being relieved, claiming you had exceeded your authority. His complaints triggered an immediate review of the incident by Pentagon Command. That review confirmed that your actions were not only appropriate but exemplary. The implications of General Hayes' call began to sink in as Sarah realized that Sterling's insubordination had been escalated far beyond the FOB level. General, was my authority questioned through official channels? Sarah asked. It was, Colonel. And it has been definitively confirmed. Furthermore, Major Sterling has been transferred from theater and will face formal disciplinary action for insubordination. Sarah understood that this incident would have far-reaching consequences beyond her immediate situation. Pentagon Command had made an official determination about her authority that would be communicated throughout the military hierarchy. Colonel Mitchell, General Hayes continued, I want you to understand something important. Your handling of this situation will be used as a case study in command authority and crisis leadership. You demonstrated that effective leadership isn't about appearing intimidating or meeting someone's expectations about what a commander should look like. It's about making the right decisions under pressure and maintaining discipline when challenged. The conversation concluded with General Hayes informing Sarah that a written commendation would be added to her personnel file, along with official documentation of the Pentagon's support for her authority. News of the Pentagon call spread through the FOB within hours. The same officers who had initially questioned Sarah's presence now understood that her authority was backed by the highest levels of military command. Lieutenant Colonel Chen approached Sarah that evening as she was completing paperwork in her office. Sarah, Chen said, using her first name for the first time, I owe you an apology. I had my doubts when we first met, and I was wrong. David, you never showed anything but professional respect, Sarah replied. Your doubts didn't affect your performance or our collaboration. Maybe not, but I realize now that I was evaluating you based on assumptions that had nothing to do with your actual capabilities. The way you handled the crisis today and the Sterling situation showed leadership I haven't seen from many senior officers. Chen's acknowledgement represented something significant. As word spread about the Pentagon's official support for Sarah's authority, officers throughout the FOB began reassessing their own assumptions about leadership and competence. The transformation in how Sarah was perceived became evident immediately. Officers who had previously questioned her presence now sought her input on tactical decisions. Personnel who had assumed she was out of place in a combat environment recognized her expertise as essential to mission success. But Sarah knew that the real test of her authority wouldn't be how people treated her at this particular FOB, but whether the Pentagon's official validation would change the broader pattern of assumptions she faced throughout her career. 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. The Pentagon had requested that she present a lecture on crisis leadership and command authority, using her own experiences as case studies. The audience consisted of senior military officers, defense contractors, and civilian Pentagon officials. What made this moment particularly significant was the introduction she received from General Patricia Hayes, the same Pentagon official who had called her during the Afghanistan incident. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hayes announced to the assembled audience, it is my privilege to introduce Colonel Sarah Mitchell, who will be discussing leadership dynamics in high-pressure operational environments. Colonel Mitchell's approach to command authority has been studied by Pentagon leadership as a model for effective crisis management. As Sarah took the podium, she noticed the familiar mix of expressions in the audience. Some officers appeared genuinely interested in her presentation. Others displayed the skeptical curiosity she had encountered throughout her career. But there was something different this time, an underlying respect that hadn't existed before the Pentagon's official validation. Good morning, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the auditorium. Today I want to talk about a question that every military leader faces at some point. What do you do when your authority is challenged not based on your decisions, but based on assumptions about who you are? The auditorium fell silent as Sarah continued her opening remarks. 6 months ago, I faced a situation where a subordinate officer questioned my authority during a crisis operation. His challenge wasn't based on disagreement with my tactical decisions or concerns about my orders. His challenge was based on his belief that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly have the experience necessary to handle a combat situation. Sarah clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which displayed a tactical map of the Afghanistan rescue operation. This is the situation we faced: a convoy under enemy fire, casualties requiring evacuation, and weather conditions that limited our response options. In that moment, I had to make two critical decisions. First, I had to develop a tactical response that would save lives. Second, I had to maintain command authority in the face of direct insubordination. For the next hour, Sarah walked the audience through every aspect of the Afghanistan incident. She explained her tactical decision-making process, her methods for maintaining team discipline under pressure, and her approach to handling challenges to authority. What made her presentation particularly powerful was her willingness to address the underlying issues directly. The officer who challenged my authority was an experienced combat veteran with multiple deployments, Sarah explained. His military record was impressive, and his tactical knowledge was substantial. But his assumption that leadership effectiveness correlates with physical appearance or meeting traditional expectations nearly compromised a mission and endangered lives. Sarah's presentation included detailed analysis of communication protocols, crisis decision-making frameworks, and leadership techniques that transcended traditional command models. But the most important element was her discussion of how assumptions about authority could undermine operational effectiveness. Effective leadership isn't about fitting someone's preconceived notions about what a commander should look like, Sarah continued. It's about making the right decisions, communicating clearly, and maintaining team discipline under pressure. When we allow assumptions to override competence, we compromise mission success. The audience response was immediate and enthusiastic. During the question and answer session that followed, senior officers asked detailed questions about leadership techniques, crisis management protocols, and methods for building authority in challenging environments. But the most significant moment came when a Marine general in the front row stood up to ask a question. Colonel Mitchell, General Rodriguez said, "Your presentation raises an important point about leadership assumptions. How do we change institutional cultures that perpetuate these assumptions?" Sarah's response addressed the heart of the issue. General, changing institutional culture requires consistent modeling of correct behavior by senior leadership. When Pentagon Command officially validated my authority in Afghanistan, it sent a clear message throughout the command structure. That kind of institutional support creates cultural change more effectively than any training program or policy directive. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by numerous officers who wanted to continue the conversation. Some shared their own experiences with leadership challenges. Others asked for advice on handling similar situations. But the most meaningful interaction came from a young Army captain who had been sitting in the back row. Colonel Mitchell, Captain Amanda Foster said, "I wanted to thank you for that presentation. I'm facing some of the same challenges you described, and your example gives me confidence that competence will eventually be recognized." Sarah studied the young officer, recognizing something of her own early career struggles. "Captain Foster, what specific challenges are you facing?" "I'm the youngest company commander in my battalion, and I'm also the only female company commander. Some of my senior enlisted personnel have expressed doubts about my experience level, and I'm struggling with how to establish authority without appearing defensive." Sarah spent 20 minutes discussing specific techniques for building command credibility with Captain Foster. The conversation reminded her of how important it was to share lessons learned with the next generation of military leaders. 3 weeks after the National Defense University presentation, Sarah received orders that would represent the culmination of her military career. She was being promoted to Brigadier General and assigned as Deputy Director of Defense Logistics Agency, a position that would make her responsible for supply chain management for the entire Department of Defense. The promotion ceremony took place at Pentagon headquarters with General Hayes presiding. The audience included senior officers from all military branches, civilian Pentagon officials, and Sarah's family members who had traveled from across the country. As General Hayes pinned the single star of a brigadier general to Sarah's uniform, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell, General Hayes announced to the assembled audience, has demonstrated that effective military leadership transcends traditional expectations and assumptions. Her approach to crisis management, team coordination, and command authority serves as a model for military leaders at all levels. Following the ceremony, Sarah was approached by dozens of well-wishers, including many officers who had worked with her throughout her career. The conversations revealed how dramatically perceptions had changed since the Afghanistan incident. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, who had traveled from his new assignment at Fort Leavenworth, was among those offering congratulations. "Sarah," Chen said, "I've been thinking about our conversation in Afghanistan. You taught me something important about evaluating people based on their capabilities rather than my assumptions. That lesson has made me a better officer and a better leader." But perhaps the most significant conversation occurred with Major General Harrison, who had worked with Sarah on multiple operations over the years. "Sarah," Harrison said, "I want you to know that the Afghanistan incident and your promotion have changed how I evaluate junior officers. I've realized that some of my best personnel were people I initially underestimated based on factors that had nothing to do with their actual performance." Sarah's response reflected the broader significance of her experience. "General, that's exactly the kind of cultural change we need. When senior leaders model correct behavior, it influences decision-making throughout the command structure." 6 months into her new position as Deputy Director of Defense Logistics Agency, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her Pentagon office. Captain Foster, the young officer she had met after the National Defense University presentation, had requested a meeting. "General Mitchell," Captain Foster said, "I wanted to update you on how your advice has worked out. I implemented the leadership techniques you suggested, and I've seen significant improvement in my unit's performance and my own credibility." Sarah was pleased to hear about Foster's progress, but she was curious about what had prompted the visit. "Captain, I'm glad things are working well for you. What brings you to the Pentagon?" "Ma'am, I've been selected for the Advanced Leadership course, and I wanted to ask if you would serve as a mentor during the program. Your example has been invaluable to my development as an officer." Sarah agreed to mentor Foster, recognizing the importance of supporting other military leaders who faced similar challenges. The mentorship represented something larger than individual career development. It was part of an ongoing effort to change institutional cultures and assumptions about leadership effectiveness. As Sarah's first year as a general officer progressed, she received feedback that demonstrated the broader impact of her career trajectory. The Pentagon's official support for her authority had created ripple effects throughout the military hierarchy, influencing how assumptions about leadership were addressed at multiple levels. Young officers who had previously felt limited by others' expectations began to see new possibilities for their own careers. Senior leaders became more conscious of their own assumptions about competence and leadership effectiveness. The institutional culture was slowly shifting toward evaluating officers based on performance rather than superficial characteristics. But Sarah understood that her individual success was only meaningful if it contributed to broader systemic change. The laughter that had once followed her rank was being replaced by respect for her competence, but the real victory would be creating an environment where future officers wouldn't face the same challenges. During a staff meeting with her senior logistics personnel, Sarah reflected on how far things had evolved since her early career experiences. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to her staff, "our primary mission is ensuring that military personnel around the world receive the supplies they need to accomplish their missions successfully. Everything else, assumptions about who belongs in leadership positions, concerns about traditional expectations, debates about conventional approaches, is secondary to mission accomplishment." Her staff, which included officers from all military branches and diverse backgrounds, nodded in agreement. The composition of the team itself reflected the institutional changes that Sarah's career had helped facilitate. As Sarah concluded her first year as a general officer, she received a letter that encapsulated the significance of her journey. The letter came from Private Johnson, the young gate guard who had initially mistaken her for a visitor at Fort Bragg years earlier. "General Mitchell," Johnson wrote, "you probably don't remember me, but I was the gate guard who didn't recognize your rank when you visited Fort Bragg. That interaction taught me an important lesson about making assumptions about people based on appearances. I want you to know that your example influenced how I treat all military personnel, regardless of what I expect them to look like. Johnson's letter concluded with news that he had been accepted to officer candidate school and hoped to follow Sarah's example of effective leadership based on competence rather than conformity to traditional expectations. The letter reminded Sarah that the impact of challenging assumptions extended far beyond individual career advancement. Every interaction, every successful mission, every demonstration of effective leadership contributed to changing institutional culture for future generations of military personnel. As Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell looked ahead to the remaining years of her military career, she understood that her greatest achievement wasn't reaching flag officer rank despite the challenges she had faced. Her greatest achievement was helping to create an environment where the next generation of military leaders would be evaluated based on their capabilities rather than others' assumptions about what effective leadership should look like. The laughter that had once followed her rank had been replaced by respect for her authority, but, more importantly, it had been replaced by institutional recognition that effective military leadership comes in many forms. The Pentagon had verified her authority not just for her individual benefit, but as confirmation that competence and character mattered more than conformity to traditional expectations. The real victory was that officers like Captain Foster would face fewer obstacles, encounter less skepticism, and have more opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities without first having to overcome assumptions based on appearance or background. Sarah's journey from underestimated lieutenant to respected general had changed more than her own career trajectory. It had contributed to changing the institutional culture of the United States military, creating opportunities for future leaders who might otherwise have been limited by others' assumptions about what military leadership should look like.